Hello and welcome to the garden. Well, I've just popped into the fruit cage here because I just wanted to review the UFO cherries that I've got growing in here. It's something I've been experimenting with over the last few years, and I've put a few videos up about them, how to start them off and the basic pruning of this sort of cherry. And I've got to the point now where I think I can comment on whether it's an effective and useful approach for a kitchen garden like this. So I wanted to do that now. They can be seen quite happily because of course all the leaves are gone. We're just into winter here. It is getting pretty chilly, but at this point it's very clear what the structure of the plants is, and you can see all of the buds on there, the fruit buds for next season. So let me just spin the camera around and maybe we'll do a quick review of the method and look at some of the benefits perhaps. So what we've got here is the main stem laid down at a fairly low angle. It's not quite horizontal. Some of them are more so than others. And off of that we've got these vertical shoots, and that is it for the structure of the tree. Ideally I'd probably just have the one shoot in each place, but I've allowed these to branch in a few places just to fill out the available space. And the idea here is to get this complete wall of fruiting wood. So the crop is being carried. There's a few little side shoots that I've left here, short stubby ones, but most of the crop is being carried on these upright shoots, and they are covered in flower buds. One of the interesting things is to see where these clusters of buds appear, and they are really common at the base of 1-year-old wood. So there's a huge cluster here. This is new wood grown this season, and at the base of this 1-year-old wood, that's where we find a big cluster of fruit buds for next year. So if we look here on this particular shoot, we've got, this is the 1-year-old wood, and that's been cut back to limit the height here. But we've got this huge cluster of fruit buds for next year. But then further down the stem on this older wood, we've got these nice little clusters of fruit buds, and this is going to crop really nicely next year. These clusters will keep this wood productive for some time, but they're not going to be as fine as these wonderful clusters you get around the base of the 1-year-old wood. So if you're cutting these back and you're producing new growth, replacement growth, you're going to get these lovely clusters of fruit buds at the base of that new wood. And that is true on many of these stems. So on this one here, there's that wonderful cluster here. This is 1-year-old wood, and this right around the base of that 1-year-old wood we've got this big cluster, and then below that we've got these smaller clusters. All of these are going to produce plenty of cherries next year. So I love cherries, sweet cherries, sour cherries. They are delicious, but they can be a bit of a pain to have in the kitchen garden for two reasons. One, they naturally make quite large trees, and they have a very upright growth habit. So they, without intervention, they will tend to shoot straight up. They make large trees, rather difficult to net, and then if you don't net them, the birds take all of the fruit before you can get to them. So ideally, if you want a good crop of cherries, you want to have them netted. And what I was doing here is looking for a method where I could grow smaller trees to manage the vigor and that upright growth habit inside the fruit cage here. Now our fruit cage, it's not entirely traditional because this is made from the frame of an old polytunnel, so the sides they're angled slightly, and then of course here they goes up at a much steeper angle. So normally in a fruit cage the sides would be square up to, I don't know, 7 foot, 2 meters, whatever height you've got the top of your fruit cage at. So you'd have a much taller straight run for the cherry trees. Now I've actually stopped these at this sort of height here, around about head height, but I could take them up the slope of the roof here, just train them up there, and they would undoubtedly do perfectly well like that. But actually I don't think there's any need here. I think they're just right at this sort of height for this fruit cage. So this method, known as upright fruiting offshoots or UFO, this is something that's been looked at for sort of commercial cherry orchards. And in fact, there's lots of interesting training regimes adopted for modern orchards, and they tend to be based on dwarfing rootstocks and high density plantings. They're quite interesting to look at, very informative, and they very often have minimal work needed to maintain them, because if you've got thousands of trees to look after, you can't have something that's going to take you hours to prune. So they tend to be very efficient methods and high density. So usually our kitchen gardens are somewhat constrained. We're fortunate here, we've got a large plot, but if you don't have too much space, you've got to have trees forms that can be accommodated within a sort of a compact space. So there's lots of interesting pruning and training regimes from that sort of commercial high density orchard world, and it's quite interesting to take some of those ideas and try them out in the kitchen garden, see how well they work. So I think typically in the orchard you'd have these rather higher, but actually I found that it works perfectly well just stopping them here at this sort of, well, about six foot height. Seems to work perfectly well for me. So the soil in the fruit cage isn't great. It's the worst in the whole plot. It's the least improved. So I've got these cherry trees on Gisela 5. If I had really great soil here, I might be looking instead at maybe Gisela 3 or something a little bit more dwarfing, but that rootstock on this particular soil has just about the right vigor for producing a tree that fills this space perfectly. So it's roughly a 2 meter square area that I want to fill with these, each one of the trees, and I've got 5 different old varieties here. So these are old traditional cherry varieties. They all need cross-pollination, and cherry pollination is a little bit complicated with the old varieties because there are lots of incompatibility groups with cherries. So you can't just pick 2 and say, well, okay, they flower at the same sort of time, so they should cross-pollinate. They've got to be in different groups. If there are groups of cherries where they won't cross-pollinate. So it can be a little bit tricky to sort out a good collection if you're growing the old varieties, which I am here. I tend to grow old stuff. But once you've got that, it's really nice to be able to have a number of different varieties in the space. You can spread the crop out a little bit. The cherry season's not that long to start with, so having some early and late varieties is really useful. And of course, it's always nice to try different things. So I've managed to get, in this 10 meter run, I've got 5 different cherry varieties, and they've all more or less filled out the space now with these vertical shoots. So this method works partly because it's on a dwarfing rootstock, but then the main stem is laid down. As soon as you lay down the main stem, you're starting to curb the vigor of the tree. And then normally with most pruning, I say you don't want vertical growth because it tends to be overly vigorous and therefore really unproductive. This is slightly different because actually here we want the vertical growth, but we've got lots of vertical growth. So it's not all concentrated in just one or two stems, but it's spread out over a number of vertical shoots. And in that way, you don't allow any particular one of those to become too vigorous. And if it does become too vigorous, you cut it back near the base and you allow a couple of replacement shoots to come up. They will grow with less vigor, and in that way you can balance the vigor across that entire space and nothing gets too out of hand. Seems to have worked pretty well here actually. As for productivity, I've already had a few really decent crops off of this. You get a really good amount of fruit around the base of the 1-year-old wood, and I mean there are some pruning regimes that exploit that and tend to produce a lot of this 1-year-old wood, so you get plenty of those clusters. This isn't really one of them, but what would happen here now, because these are effectively in their established state. All of the branches have reached the height I want and they've been pruned back to that height. So in the future, as one or two of these branches become a little less productive, they will be cut back and new shoots can grow up to replace them, and then you'll get more of that sort of really productive wood around the base of that 1-year-old shoot. So you get quite a nice crop off of these cherries, and of course you don't have to thin them. There's no overloading of the tree as there would be with say plums, something like that, where you can have to thin the crop quite a bit in order to get decent fruit, and also to get a decent crop the following year. With the cherries you don't have to worry about thinning it, and because they're under the net, the birds don't get to steal them, so all of those cherries are mine. Well, they won't be for long because I am moving out of this garden, but that's something for another video. But I found this method to be really handy, and it's pretty easy. So long as you've got a suitable rootstock for your soil conditions, and it wants to be a dwarfing rootstock, preferably a fairly precocious rootstock, so that's one that will come to fruit quite early, because as soon as the tree starts to fruit, that takes away some of the energy that would otherwise go into vegetative growth. So that's yet another way of curbing the excess natural vigor of the cherry tree itself. And then you simply have to rub out all of the shoots on that main branch that you don't want. You select the vertical shoots, tie them in, and the job is done. There's not a lot of new growth coming from the main stem. There is extension growth coming from the upright shoots, of course, and there will be some side shoots produced, but it's not excessive. If you get that match right, the rootstock to the soil conditions for the space that you've got available, and you could obviously do this in a larger space. I've got this 2x2 meter space here. If you could give it a bit more height or a bit more length, that'd be fine. But once you've got the balance right, so that the tree as a whole is not overly vigorous for the space you've got, then it's a pretty low maintenance job. You have to look at them maybe twice a year at most to prune and tie in. And of course we don't touch these during the winter. We only prune these from bud break in the spring and then up to, let's say, late summer or actually not too long after the crop has been taken. So there's, you know, twice a year to come along and prune and tie in the growth. It's pretty efficient, and it's such a simple regime here that you don't have to do a lot of thinking about, oh, where am I going to cut? What am I going to do now? It's all about managing that vigor. So if you have an excessively vigorous stem, you cut that back and allow less vigorous shoots to take over. And otherwise, it's a case now of maintenance and looking for unproductive wood or anything that's diseased or damaged, and cutting that out and tying in the new growth. So I think this method works pretty well. I would certainly, if I had this situation again in the future, I would not hesitate in applying this UFO method in the kitchen garden. I think it is great. It can be a little tricky getting the varieties you want on particularly dwarfing rootstocks, but specialist fruit nurseries, they have a much wider range of rootstocks than a typical garden centre. So you may have to look to those specialist suppliers, and for these varieties that I have here, they've all come from that sort of place. I think most of these, possibly all of these, came from Keeper's Nursery. They've got a wide range of older varieties and on different sorts of rootstocks. But that is it, I think. That's pretty much all I wanted to say, just to give you a quick look at how they're doing. Maybe if I turn the camera around, I can give you a view down the row and you can see how well it's filled in. So we've got all of these vertical branches. They're, I don't know, 6 inches apart typically, which is about right. They don't get in each other's way. Onto the second tree here. Hopefully there might be another vertical shoot coming from that to fill in this space, but we've got them regularly all the way along this here. This one is a little bit sparse. It needs another vertical shoot, and I think that there's a young one coming here. There was another here, but it was damaged, so it's been pruned back, and I would think in the coming year this one's going to shoot up, and then hopefully something else from here. But then again, we've got at regular intervals all the way along right to the end a complete wall of cherries, which is delightful to see. So I don't think this is a method that you'll find in many of the gardening books, but there is a ton of information out there on this method. There are some wonderful videos and everything you need to know about pruning and training using this method. I've adapted it a little bit to suit my conditions here, but I'm really happy with how this has worked out. And as I mentioned before, anytime you're thinking about trying to fit in a tree in a tight space, it's always worth taking a look at what the commercial orchardists are doing nowadays, because they tend to be really closely packed, and then they'll be on those dwarfing rootstocks that are really going to help keep excess vigor under control. But anyway, that is it for this video. Thanks ever so much for watching, and bye for now.